In the 1967 book, The Illusion of Permanence, British Imperialism in India, Francis G. Hutchins describes the fragility of imperial confidence, noting how British imperialism in India reached its height of consciousness at the turn of the 20th century, right as the British Empire was on the verge of becoming non-viable. Quote, "The empire was never more fragile than at this moment when it seemed most secure. The rationalizations of the necessity for continuing British rule were never more complete than at this moment when they no longer applied," Hutchins wrote. The illusion of permanence, he said, evolved into a full-blown confidence in England's role in India that surpassed the faith of earlier generations. With success comes confidence, and with confidence comes complacency. And that's precisely where the United States has found itself in the early 21st century. Relatively speaking, the United States has seen mere moments of true prosperity and affluence, and while the country was founded on the very belief in America and the possibilities for the future, it was really the mid to late 20th century when the American people knew that great things were on the horizon. While wars still raged and the economy fluctuated as we headed toward the millennium, the landing of rockets on the moon and the invention of the internet, something that physicist Michio Kaku has described as a Type 1 civilization invention that draws us closer to becoming an advanced galactic species, indicated that the American empire had emerged out of an age of affluence and into a new age of intellectual and scientific pursuit. This new age, however, would not have been possible without periods of human growth, not just economic, but in how people treated one another. The Kennedy era, short though it was, along with the civil rights movement, offered great hope for the United States as the country found its feet economically. It was a time when the United States sought to overcome division, when Americans started to learn to live together, and when both major parties could agree on fundamental truths and the liberal foundations of the country, in the truest sense of that term. An imperfect union though it was, the United States was an inspiration for the rest of the world. It was the shining city on the hill, an example for the communist states that found their freedom and a place where anything was possible. Sir John Glubb, a British soldier, scholar, and fellow Lancastrian, described in his 1976 book, The Fate of Empires, how throughout human history, empires have emerged from an age of pioneers, before gradually moving through an age of conquest to an age of commerce, then to an age of affluence, and later an age of intellect. And, just as Glubb notes that there are no true start and end dates for these empires, with each emerging gradually over a period of time and then disappearing through a phase of decline, there are no true start and end dates for each age an empire endures before its death. Glubb suggested that the United States reached a period of, quote, high noon during its age of affluence in the Woodrow Wilson era, while the United Kingdom reached its age of affluence under the rule of Queen Victoria. That age of affluence was arguably interrupted by the outbreak of the Second World War and extended toward the millennium. I would argue that at the turn of the 21st century, the United States, and the West generally, reached the age of intellect that Glubb described as a time of, quote, surprising advances in natural science, end quote, where intellectuals attaining new triumphs in academia and science politically became the, quote, abject servants of the often illiterate rulers, end quote. The very nature of this age of intellectualism, however, appears to have undone many of the great strides made during the civil rights era and left the United States more divided than ever. Quote, as in the case of the Athenians, intellectualism leads to discussion, debate, and argument, such as is typical of the Western nations today, Glubb writes, adding that by the nature of men being, quote, interminably different, and the fact that intellectual arguments so rarely lead to agreement, public affairs quickly go from bad to worse. Remarkably, Glubb accurately predicted, by analyzing the great empires of the past, how the United States would soon be consumed by political divides that seem impossible to resolve. Quote, "Another remarkable and unexpected symptom of national decline is the intensification of internal political hatreds. One would have expected that, when the survival of the nation becomes precarious, political factions would drop their rivalry and stand shoulder to shoulder to save their country," Glubb wrote. If Glubb was right about America's eventual drift toward hyperpartisanship, then we must hope that he wasn't also correct about how an empire's period of decline facilitates the separation of a once united melting pot of people into communities and factions. Once decline sets in, he warned, quote, "It is extraordinary how the memory of ancient wars, perhaps century before, is suddenly revived, and local or provincial movements appear demanding secession or independence," end quote. The hard fought for rights of every American, the great achievements of one of the world's newest and most powerful nations, and the promise of a freer and more prosperous future are all at risk. As we move from an age of intellectualism to an age of frivolity, Americans would be wise to heed the warnings of the past and address the partisanship that risks pushing this ship onto the rocks. It's easy to forget that the world we live in is a fragile one. Not just our ecosystem, but every facet of our modern lives, from our financial institutions and our government to the very homes in which we reside. In 2024, the Western world, in particular, may have achieved enormous technological feats, and our standard of living may be technically better than at any other time in history. But for anybody watching closely the dynamics at play in virtually all areas of society, we're on the brink of a collapse. Fresh off the back of a historic pandemic, never before seen lockdowns that required children to cover their faces and parents to stay locked at home for months on end, it would stand to reason that the fragility of our world would be obvious to all of us. But it's not. America's imperial confidence has seemingly reached its height, and at any moment we may see our just-in-time supply chains collapse, currencies rapidly lose their value, human labor replaced by advanced software, and the very idea of a nation-state challenged by the breaking down of international borders. And yet, as we stand here on the verge of this potentially irremediable social and economic collapse, our leaders distract the populace with petty arguments and half-truths, pandering to vocal extreme minorities, seemingly unaware that the chasm they've carved virtually down the middle of our society is growing deeper and wider by the day. It's hard to know whether our leaders know that these cracks just keep getting bigger, and if they do, whether they believe that half the country will eventually snap out of what they think is a collective delusion and side with their abusers in the hope of one day returning to some kind of normality. Regardless of what they may think, though, normality is not a guarantee, and our world will likely change forever. America's leaders are not just fiddling while Rome burns. One side provided the tinder, and the other side rocked up with a jerry can full of petrol and a box of matches. So often, decline is a choice made unconsciously, and the social divisions, the puerile nature of modern politics, and the authoritarian lurch of many on both the left and right have put this country onto a track of permanent, irreversible decline. Today, the United States is not the America I saw on the television as a child growing up in Northern England. The illusion of permanence is exactly that, an illusion. No age of affluence can last forever. Intellectualism cannot survive without an economy and functional society that supports it, and without a dramatic change in leadership, the United States may continue its downward spiral into decay. That's not to say that this great nation cannot buck the trends seen throughout the millennia. Our resources today vastly outweigh the resources of the Ottomans and the Romans. We're on the cusp of developing practical nuclear fusion and quantum computers. Mad billionaires are preparing to take the human species to Mars. We're perfecting technologies that may one day allow us to control the weather and prevent natural disasters. We have so much left to strive for, but the United States needs to redeem itself. It needs to find new leaders with a fundamentally different approach to government and leadership. It needs to find solutions to the divisive issues of our time before it's too late. And we can't find those solutions with a partisan in the White House. If America has any hope of bucking the trend that Glubb observed in 1976, and for its people to drop their rivalry in pursuit of a new high noon, it might take an independent like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. winning in November to achieve it.